Good day, dear listener. Pull up a comfortable chair, pour yourself a cup of tea, and allow me to whisk you away to the sleepy English village of St. Mary Mead, sometime in the gentle autumn of 1951. The war is over, the roses are in bloom, and Miss Jane Marple, knitting needles ever in hand, has once again found herself in the midst of a most puzzling little problem. You are about to listen to Miss Marple and the Postmistress's tale. Settle in. The game is afoot. Chapter 1. The Missing Letters. The village of St. Mary Mead lay hushed under a pale September sun in the year 1951. The war had been over for 6 peaceful years, rationing was easing, and the horse chestnuts along the high street had begun to shed their leaves in slow, golden spirals. Smoke rose in thin blue columns from cottage chimneys, carrying the comforting scent of coal and applewood. And somewhere a blackbird practiced its autumn song as though nothing untoward could ever disturb the quiet rhythm of English country life. At 20 minutes past 10 on a Tuesday morning, Miss Jane Marple closed the little wrought-iron gate of Danemead, her neat gray head uncovered, a light marketing basket over one arm and her umbrella, though the sky was cloudless, hooked over the other. She moved at the gentle pace expected of a lady in her 79th year. Yet there was nothing frail about the bright blue eyes that noticed everything. The new curtain lace at the Hartnells, the fact that young Leonard Spence, the telegraph boy, had polished his bicycle lamps, and the small, significant detail that the flag above the post office was flying at half-mast, though no one had died. Miss Marple's destination, as it was every second day, was the post office. She liked to collect the Times, post the occasional letter to her nephew Raymond in America, and exchange a polite word with Miss Gladys Brent, who had ruled the counter with mild despotism for 32 years. Gladys was a spare, angular woman of 58, always dressed in a navy overall and cotton gloves with iron-gray hair strained back into a bun so tight it seemed to lift her eyebrows in permanent surprise. The post office stood wedged between Sims the butcher and Mr. Petherick the solicitor's prim Georgian house. Its red brick facade was adorned with the familiar gilded crown and the words, Crown Post Office, in proud black lettering. Above the door a small bell gave its customary silvery ting-a-ling as Miss Marple entered. She paused on the threshold. The place was empty. The grill was down, the brass bell on the counter untouched, the little wooden notice that usually read "Back in 5 minutes" nowhere to be seen. Only one customer waited. Mrs. Price from the grocery, tapping an impatient foot and studying her shopping list as though it might offer enlightenment. "Good morning, Mrs. Price," said Miss Marple pleasantly. Mrs. Price started. "Oh, Miss Marple, I've been here a full 4 minutes and not a peep out of Gladys, most unlike her. She's usually punctual to the second." Miss Marple advanced to the counter and peered over. The sorting room door at the back stood ajar. A chair lay overturned. Papers were scattered across the floor like large white confetti, and on the linoleum half under the counter lay a single blue airmail envelope, its corner torn as though someone had trodden upon it in haste. Miss Marple's eyebrows rose a fraction of an inch. "Gladys?" she called softly. No answer came save the faint ticking of the wall clock. With the calm of one who has seen worse things in the Blitz, Miss Marple lifted the counter flap, stepped through, and retrieved the envelope with delicate fingers. The address was written in hurried continental script. Mrs. Lavinia Pinkerton, CIO Miss G. Brent, Postmistress St. Mary Mead, Surrey, England. There was no stamp, no postmark. It had never been through the mails. At that moment the shop bell jangled violently and Leonard Spence burst in, scarlet in the face, cap askew, clutching his red GPO satchel. "Miss Marple, have you seen Miss Brent? There's been an awful upset. Mrs. Pinkerton's in ever such a state at the old manor house. Says her sister's new will was meant to come by registered post yesterday and it's vanished into thin air. And now Gladys has vanished too. Miss Marple regarded the boy with the mild interest she might accord an unexpected shower of rain. Vanished, Leonard? Clean gone. Mrs. Swettenham saw her cycling towards the station at 8:30 with a big brown suitcase. Only the London train leaves at 25 past, and Mr. Ballard swears she never bought a ticket. Mrs. Price gave a small shriek. Gladys Brent run off? Never. She saved every penny for her retirement cottage in Budleigh Salterton. Miss Marple turned the blue envelope over in her hands. The paper was thin, expensive, the kind used on the continent. The ink had a faint violet tinge. Dear me, she said quietly. How very disturbing. She moved to the sorting table. A cup of tea stood cold and untouched, a film across its surface. The ledger lay open at Monday's entries. 5 registered packets had been accepted between 3 and 5:30. None had been dispatched. In the small iron grate lay a heap of ash and half-burnt corners of paper, one bearing the printed heading Lloyd's Bank Limited in purple. Miss Marple's gaze traveled to the wooden rack of pigeonholes labeled AZ. The slot for P contained only a seed catalog and a picture postcard of Margate. Whatever had been expected for Mrs. Pinkerton was no longer there. Outside, the church clock struck the quarter. Somewhere a dog barked. The peaceful morning continued, yet beneath its surface something had shifted, like a trout moving under still water. Miss Marple laid the blue envelope gently on the counter exactly where it might have fallen. I think, Leonard, she said, you had better cycle to the police house and ask Paulk to telephone Inspector Craddock at Much Benham. And perhaps someone ought to inform Colonel Bantry. He was expecting an important letter himself yesterday. Leonard hesitated, round-eyed. Do you think it's murder, Miss Marple? Good gracious, no, said Miss Marple briskly. Murder is so seldom necessary in a village this size. But something has certainly happened to poor Miss Brent, and something equally unfortunate to several pieces of mail. That is quite disturbing enough for one morning. She retrieved her basket and umbrella. Come along, Mrs. Price. We mustn't hinder the authorities. I dare say everything will be explained in time. Yet as she stepped back into the sunshine, Miss Marple's lips pursed in the faintest of smiles. She had seen in her long life many disturbances begin with nothing more dramatic than an empty post office and a torn blue envelope, and she knew, with the quiet certainty of experience, that this one was only just beginning. Chapter 2. The 5 Who Waited for Letters by Luncheon. The whole of St. Mary Mead knew that Miss Gladys Brent had disappeared and that several pieces of extremely private correspondence had disappeared with her. The High Street hummed like a hive that has discovered an intruder. Mrs. Baker at the bakery sold out of currant buns twice over, so many people found it necessary to drop in for a small loaf and a chat. Even the ducks on the pond seemed to quack in a more agitated manner. At 2:30, Inspector Dermot Craddock arrived from Much Benham in a gleaming black Wolseley, scattering gravel outside the Blue Boar with democratic impartiality. He was a tall, dark young man with a deceptively mild manner, and the memory of a previous visit to St. Mary Mead still fresh enough to make him wary of elderly ladies who knitted. The Red Cross Sewing Committee had been due to meet at 4 o'clock in the parish room, but Mrs. Dane Calthrop, the vicar's wife, tactfully moved the venue to the larger lounge of the Blue Boar because of the drafts. Everyone understood perfectly that the real purpose was to discover what everyone else knew about the postmistress. Miss Marple arrived precisely at 2 minutes to 4, settled herself in the corner by the fireplace, and opened her knitting bag. The needles began their soft, rhythmic click. She looked to the casual eye exactly like any other harmless old lady waiting for her tea. The interested parties assembled with the casual air of people who had merely happened to be passing. First came Colonel Lucius Bantry, retired Indian Army, face red as a turkey cock, mustache bristling with indignation. He had been expecting a letter from his solicitors confirming the sale of 5 acres of meadow to the county council, a transaction that would pay for a new greenhouse and keep his wife Dolly in orchids for life. Next swept in Mrs. Daphne Swettenham, the village's acknowledged beauty, dressed in rust-colored tweeds that set off her auburn hair to perfection. She let it be known in a thrilling undertone that she had been awaiting a most delicate communication from an old admirer now farming in Kenya, and that its non-arrival had caused her the most acute embarrassment. Mr. Reginald Archer, the quiet organist and choir master of St. Mary's, slipped in almost unnoticed. He was a thin, bespectacled man of 45 with nervous hands that continually smoothed an already smooth sheet of music. He murmured something about examination results for his pupil Jeremy being delayed, though nobody could quite see why that required registered post. Miss Amy Tarrant, the district nurse, marched in with the brisk efficiency of one who has seen everything and been shocked by none of it. She announced loudly that certain medical certificates of a highly confidential nature had gone astray, and that in her opinion the post office authorities ought to be sued. Last of all, propelled by a sense of drama rather than punctuality, arrived Mrs. Lavinia Pinkerton herself, bird-like and twittering, wrapped in mothball-scented black lace despite the warmth of the day. She was the elder sister of the late Mrs. Clara Hetherington, who had died 3 weeks previously in a Swiss sanatorium, leaving, rumor said, a considerable fortune and 2 contradictory wills. Mrs. Pinkerton sank into a chair and fanned herself with a handkerchief edged in Honiton lace. My sister's final instructions were posted from Lausanne on the 3rd, she declared to the room at large. They were to be forwarded to Mr. Petherick by registered post. Gladys promised faithfully to attend to it on Monday. And now everything is lost. I shall be ruined, quite ruined. Colonel Bantry gave a snort that might have been sympathy or wind. Inspector Craddock, who had been standing quietly by the mantelpiece, cleared his throat. "If I might have your attention for a moment," he began pleasantly. "Miss Brent accepted 5 registered packets on Monday afternoon between 3 and 5:30. None have been dispatched. Miss Brent was seen leaving the village at approximately 8:30 yesterday morning with a large brown suitcase. She has not been seen since. I should be grateful if each of you would confirm handing over your envelope personally to Miss Brent." One by one they did so, with varying degrees of indignation and self-importance. Miss Marple's needles never paused. When Mrs. Pinkerton had finished a second fluttering account of Swiss solicitors and sealed instructions, Miss Marple looked up with her gentle, disarming smile. "Tell me, Mrs. Pinkerton, did your sister have a companion during her last illness?" "Oh yes, a most managing woman called Miss Blacklock, or Black, I forget which. Clara was always rewriting her will. First everything to me, then half to some absurd theosophical society in Tavistock Square, then back to me again. Miss Black was furious about the society, naturally." "Naturally," murmured Miss Marple. Mrs. Swettenham leaned forward, eyes sparkling. "And did this Miss Black return to England?" "She did indeed. Lives in the little white cottage by the duck pond. Such a very determined woman. Always borrowing my garden shears and never returning them." Colonel Bantry gave another snort. "Sounds like half the women in this village." Miss Marple's gaze rested for a moment on Mr. Archer's left hand, which rested on his knee. The cuff of his gray suit had ridden up slightly, revealing a faint purple stain on the fingers, copying ink, indelible, the sort used for duplicating hymn sheets. She smiled serenely and offered the plate of sandwiches. "Butter or paste, Mr. Archer?" The organist started as though he had been asleep. "Oh, butter, thank you, Miss Marple." Outside, the September light began to fade and the fire crackled comfortably. 5 people sat nursing 5 separate grievances, each convinced their own letter was the most important. None of them noticed the elderly lady in the corner counting stitches with quiet satisfaction. She had learned long ago that when 5 people all protest too much, it is wise to discover what, precisely, they are protesting about. And something about the faint scent of violet ink lingering in the air reminded her of another occasion, many years ago, when a will had gone missing and a pair of white kid gloves had played a most significant part. But that, of course, was another story. Chapter 3. The Matter of the Torn Envelope. The following morning dawned soft and misty, the sort of autumn day that makes St. Mary Mead look as though it has been gently watercolored by an indulgent deity. Miss Marple rose at her usual hour, fed the robin who now regarded her garden as a private dining room, and after a light breakfast of toast and Cooper's Oxford, set out with the deliberate air of a lady who has an appointment with curiosity. She reached the post office at 9:30. P.C. Polk stood on the step looking important and slightly chilled, his helmet tilted at a self-conscious angle. "Morning, Miss Marple," he said, touching the peak. "Inspector Craddock's inside with the fingerprint powder. Nothing to report yet, ma'am." Miss Marple gave him the small, approving smile she reserved for village officials doing their best. "I am sure the inspector is being most thorough, Constable. Might I just peep in for a moment? I believe I left my library book on the counter yesterday." Polk, who had known Miss Marple since she rescued him from a tree at the age of 7, stood aside with only the faintest hesitation. Inside, the little shop smelled of paraffin and sealing wax and something faintly acrid, burnt paper. Inspector Craddock, coat off, was crouched by the grate with a small sieve. "Ah, Miss Marple," he said, straightening. "I might have known you would appear sooner or later. One does like to keep abreast of things, Inspector." She advanced to the counter. "Such a pity about poor Gladys. Do we know any more?" "Only that she was seen boarding the 8:27 to Much Benham without a ticket. Paid cash. No one remembers her face. She wore a motor veil. The suitcase was heavy." Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the sorting table. The cold cup of tea had been removed, but the open ledger remained. She noted the 5 entries in Gladys's neat post office hand. 3:12 p.m. Cole L. Bantry, large envelope, sealed red wax. 3:47 p.m. Mrs. D. Swetnam, small packet, string, 4:05 p.m. Mr. R. Archer, envelope, purple seal, 4:28 p.m. Nurse A. Tarrant, official envelope, OHMS, 5:19 p.m. Mrs. L. Pinkerton, packet X, Switzerland, blue airmail cover. None marked as dispatched. In the grate, the ashes had been sifted. Craddock had arranged the surviving fragments on a sheet of newspaper. Corners of heavy cream paper, traces of red wax, purple wax, and one unmistakable scrap bearing the printed heading, Lloyd's Bank Private Client Department. "Someone made a thorough job of it," Craddock said grimly. "But they missed the bit that matters." Miss Marple's attention had moved to the shelves behind the counter. A stack of postal orders, a box of twopenny stamps, and half concealed by both, the corner of something white and soft. She reached out with the handle of her umbrella and delicately hooked it free. A single left-hand white kid glove, size 6, faintly soiled at the fingertips with what looked suspiciously like violet copying ink. Craddock whistled softly. Gladys always wore cotton gloves for sorting. Sensible woman. "Exactly," murmured Miss Marple. "Kid gloves are for afternoon calls or concerts or impersonating someone rather more fashionable than oneself." She laid the glove on the counter beside the torn blue envelope, which now reposed in a cellophane evidence bag. "Notice anything, Inspector?" Craddock bent closer. The envelope's flap had been slit with a sharp knife, then clumsily refolded. A faint fingerprint, someone's thumb, smudged the gum. "Opened and resealed," he said. "Indeed. and then dropped or perhaps placed on the floor for us to find. Rather too conveniently, don't you think? Craddock gave her a sharp glance. You believe the entire disappearance was staged? I believe, said Miss Marple, that someone very much wanted us to think Gladys Brent had run away with incriminating letters. But running away is noisy. Burning papers is smoky, and white kid gloves are memorable. Altogether, rather a lot of clues for a guilty person to leave lying about. She turned to the pigeonholes. The slot marked P still contained only the seed catalog and the postcard of Margate. Yet the real Swiss letter never reached this office at all, she continued softly. Someone intercepted it earlier. Someone who knew it was coming. Craddock rubbed his chin. The postman? Old Granger's been on the round for 40 years. No, someone who could receive continental mail without suspicion. Someone who perhaps shares a house with a person recently returned from Switzerland. She thanked the inspector prettily, collected her entirely imaginary library book, and departed. Her next stop was the railway station, where Mr. Ballard, the station master, was polishing his spectacles with an air of injured dignity. No, Miss Marple, Miss Brent most certainly did not buy a ticket yesterday. I'd have remembered. But at 8:26, a lady in a gray coat and hat, face veiled, came hurrying along the lane from the direction of Laburnum Road. Carried a brown suitcase, paid cash to Much Benham only, and boarded the train just as we were about to whistle. Very nearly missed it. Laburnum Road, repeated Miss Marple thoughtfully. That would be the shortcut from the Duck Pond cottages. Mr. Ballard nodded. Funny thing, she had a little smear of purple on her glove. Ink, I shouldn't wonder. Miss Marple thanked him and walked on, passing the duck pond where the willows trailed their fingers in the water, and a pair of mallards quarreled over a crust. At the far end stood a small white cottage with a neat garden. A card in the window read, Miss L. Black, piano lessons. Smoke curled from the chimney, though the day was mild. Someone was burning papers. Miss Marple paused only long enough to notice that the dustbin beside the gate contained a quantity of pale gray ash and the blackened metal spine of what had once been a passport. She did not stop. There was plenty of time. Back in the high street, she met Nurse Tarrant striding along with her district bag. Such a to-do, the nurse exclaimed. Poor Mrs. Pinkerton's in a terrible state about her sister's will. Keep saying Miss Black will be furious when she learns the money's gone to some heathen society. Miss Marple smiled. People do become heated about money, don't they? Though I always think it reveals more about the living than the dead. She continued homeward, her mind busy. A veiled woman in kid gloves, a burnt passport, purple ink, and a fire on a warm day. The pieces were beginning to arrange themselves rather like the border of the new knitting pattern she had just begun. And at the center of the pattern, still hidden, lay the reason why someone had gone to such very elaborate lengths to make a perfectly innocent postmistress disappear for 24 hours. Miss Marple opened her gate, stepped inside, and closed it softly behind her. Dear me, she said to the robin who was waiting on the bird table. How very interesting it all becomes. Chapter 4. Tea with Mrs. Pinkerton and a pair of borrowed shears. The afternoon was golden and windless, the sort of afternoon that makes even the most restless soul feel that nothing truly dreadful can happen before tomorrow. Miss Marple, however, had never believed in postponing the inevitable. At 20 minutes past 3, she presented herself at the wrought iron gates of the old manor house, carrying a small jar of her homemade blackberry jelly as a peace offering. Mrs. Lavinia Pinkerton received her in the morning room, a chamber so crowded with mahogany and mourning photographs that it felt like sitting inside a very superior coffin. The old lady was dressed in rustling black silk, a cameo brooch at her throat, and an expression of perpetual grievance upon her small, powdered face. Jane, dear, how kind. I have been quite prostrated. First Clara dies, then the will vanishes, and now that dreadful postmistress has absconded with my entire future. Miss Marple settled herself on a tapestry chair and accepted a cup of lapsang souchong so delicate it might have been brewed by elves. Gladys has not absconded, Lavinia. I am sure she will return presently. Tell me more about this second will. Mrs. Pinkerton dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief that had once belonged to Queen Alexandra. Clara was always changeable. The first will left everything to me, naturally. Then she met those dreadful theosophists in Lausanne and rewrote it, half to me, half to their ridiculous society. Then 3 days before she died, she changed her mind again. She wrote to me saying she had destroyed the second will and posted a new one, leaving everything to me after all, with a small legacy to Miss Black for faithful service. The letter was to come by registered post via the post office here. And now it is gone. Miss Black, said Miss Marple thoughtfully. She was your sister's companion for many years, I understand. Far too many. A managing sort of woman. Always borrowing things, my garden shears, my silver thimble, my best umbrella. Never returns anything. Still, Clara was fond of her. Miss Marple sipped her tea. And Miss Black returned to St. Mary Mead when? 2 weeks ago. Took the little white cottage by the duck pond. Says she wishes to be near the church because of the music. Mr. Archer gives her piano lessons, though goodness knows why. She plays perfectly well already. Miss Marple set her cup down with a gentle chink. Does she wear white kid gloves by any chance? Mrs. Pinkerton blinked. Why, yes, the most elegant pair. Italian, she told Clara, always complaining they are impossible to clean. Outside the window, a gardener was clipping the yew hedge with a pair of shears that looked remarkably familiar. Those shears, said Miss Marple mildly. Are they yours, Lavinia? Mrs. Pinkerton peered. They most certainly are. I lent them to Miss Black in August and have never had them back. Really, some people. Miss Marple rose. Thank you, my dear. You have been most helpful. I shall call again when Gladys is safely home. She left Mrs. Pinkerton fluttering and indignant and walked slowly down the drive, pausing only to examine the flower bed beneath the morning room window. There, half hidden by Michaelmas daisies, lay a small heap of gray ash and one corner of blue airmail paper bearing the printed word, Testament. Miss Marple did not touch it. She merely noted its position and continued on her way. Her next visit was to the cottage by the duck pond. Miss Letitia Black opened the door herself. She was a tall, handsome woman in her late 50s with iron-gray hair cropped short and the upright carriage of one who has managed other people's lives for decades. She wore a charcoal skirt and a white blouse fastened with a cairngorm brooch. Miss Marple, to what do I owe this pleasure? I happened to be passing, said Miss Marple, and thought I might inquire about piano lessons for my great niece. She is staying with me next spring. Miss Black's eyes flickered, surprise, perhaps, or calculation. Do come in, though I fear I am rather occupied at present. The little sitting room was impeccably tidy. On the mantelpiece stood a photograph of a younger Miss Black with the late Mrs. Hetherington in Swiss mountains. On the table lay a pair of white kid gloves, one finger delicately mended with lighter thread. A faint smell of singeing lingered in the air. Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the fireplace. The fire was newly laid, but a scrap of purple sealing wax had melted into the hearth tiles. You have a charming cottage, she said. So convenient for the church. Mr. Archer must be an excellent teacher. Miss Black's smile was thin. He is competent, though I sometimes feel I teach him more than he teaches me. Miss Marple noticed a brown suitcase, still faintly damp, standing behind the sofa. You have been traveling? Only to Much Benham and back. A sudden whim to visit an old friend. On the 8:27, perhaps? Miss Black's composure did not falter, but something moved behind her eyes. Really, Miss Marple, village gossip travels faster than the train. Miss Marple rose. I must not keep you. Thank you for your time. At the gate, she paused to admire a bed of late roses. Beside it lay the missing garden shears, blades flecked with green. She walked on, past the pond where the ducks were settling for the evening, and allowed herself the smallest of smiles. Two women had borrowed things that were not theirs. One had borrowed garden shears and a future inheritance. The other had borrowed a brown suitcase, a veil, and 24 hours of harmless absence on the part of Gladys Brent. And both, it seemed, had borrowed rather more than they could ever hope to return. As she reached the lich gate of St. Mary's, the organ began to play. Bach's toccata in D minor, strong, confident, a shade too fast. Miss Marple stood listening for a moment. Dear me, she murmured, such beautiful playing. One does wonder why the pupil pretends to need lessons from the master. She continued homeward through the quiet lanes, her mind busy with the pattern that was slowly, gracefully forming. A pair of white kid gloves, a borrowed suitcase, a forged telegram, for surely that was how poor Gladys had been lured away, and two wills, one burnt and one hidden. It was all most interesting. And as Miss Marple reflected while she measured wool for a new scarf, when people go to such elaborate lengths to appear guilty of theft, it is often because they are guilty of something a great deal more serious. Chapter 5. The Organist's Alibi and the Stain That Would Not Lie. Thursday brought a brisk north wind that sent the last reluctant leaves skittering along the high street and made the sign above the post office creak like a ship at anchor. By 10 o'clock, the news had traveled the length of St. Mary Mead and back again. Gladys Brent had returned. She walked into the post office at opening time, brown suitcase in hand, looking pale and bewildered, but otherwise unharmed. P.C. Polk, who had been stationed there since dawn, nearly dropped his notebook. Miss Brent, where in heaven's name have you been? Gladys set the case down with a thud and burst into tears. My aunt in Much Benham was taken dreadful poorly. I had a telegram Monday night. I caught the early train yesterday and stayed overnight. I never thought it would cause such a fuss. Inspector Craddock, summoned from the Blue Boar where he had been consuming a late breakfast, arrived breathless. Telegram, he repeated. May we see it? Gladys opened her handbag and produced a crumpled yellow form. Craddock read aloud, Aunt Emily, seriously, ill, stop, come at once, stop, do not delay, stop, doctor, no signature. The message had been handed in at Much Benham Post Office at 6:15 p.m. on Monday. Craddock's face darkened. Your Aunt Emily died in 1947, Miss Brent. We checked yesterday. Gladys gave a small, stricken cry and sat down heavily on the stool behind the counter. Then who? Exactly, said Craddock grimly. The 5 registered packets were produced from the safe, seals apparently intact. Mrs. Pinkerton, Colonel Bantry, Mrs. Swetnam, Nurse Tarrant, and Mr. Archer were summoned to identify their property. One by one, the envelopes were opened. Colonel Bantry's contained his solicitor's letter, untouched. Mrs. Swetnam's held a perfectly innocuous note from her Kenyan admirer. Nurse Tarrant's medical certificates were all present. Mr. Archer's examination results were there, slightly creased but genuine. Only Mrs. Pinkerton's packet yielded nothing but blank sheets of expensive cream paper. Mrs. Pinkerton promptly fainted into the arms of P.C. Polk. When she had been revived with sal volatile, Miss Marple, who had been quietly observing from the corner, spoke for the first time. Curious, she said. 4 letters perfectly correct, one substituted with blanks, yet all 5 seals unbroken. Someone, it seems, is a very competent forger indeed. Mr. Archer cleared his throat nervously. I really must be going. Jeremy Price has his lesson at 11. Miss Marple turned her mild blue gaze upon him. Of course, Mr. Archer. Though I believe Jeremy was with you yesterday morning from 8:15 until 9, was he not? Practicing scales while a veiled lady boarded the 8:27? The organist went very still. Jeremy is a most attentive pupil. So attentive, said Miss Marple, that he left a purple stain on his left hand from the copying ink you use for hymn sheets. The same ink, I fancy, that appears on certain burnt fragments in Monday's grate. Jeremy Price, dragged blushing from the churchyard where he had been loitering, admitted under gentle pressure that he had been copying hymns on Tuesday afternoon, not Wednesday morning, and that Mr. Archer had given him 6pence to say otherwise if anyone asked. Mr. Archer's composure cracked like thin ice. It was only a little white lie. I had an appointment in Much Benham. At the post office, perhaps, said Craddock, to send a telegram to yourself? The organist said nothing. His left hand, Miss Marple noted with quiet satisfaction, still bore the faintest violet shadow beneath the nails. That afternoon Miss Marple took a gentle stroll past the church. The organ was silent. Mr. Archer had been taken to Much Benham for further questioning. She paused at the lich gate and watched Miss Letitia Black walking briskly across the churchyard carrying a large parcel wrapped in brown paper. Their eyes met. For a moment neither woman moved. Then Miss Black inclined her head with cool civility and continued toward the duck pond. Miss Marple followed at a discreet distance. At the water's edge, Miss Black glanced round once, then hurled the parcel far out among the reeds. It landed with a splash and began to sink. The mallards scattered in indignation. Miss Marple reached the bank just as the ripples died. A pity, she said conversationally. Registered envelopes are so difficult to dry once they are wet. Miss Black spun round, color draining from her face. Miss Marple, I was merely disposing of some old music. Indeed, though the postmark on that parcel looked remarkably like Lausanne. For a moment the two women regarded each other, the tall, handsome companion and the small, gray-haired spinster with eyes like wintry skies. Then Miss Black laughed, a short, hard sound. You are very clever, Miss Marple, but cleverness is not proof. No, agreed Miss Marple amiably, but constables with grappling hooks often are. She turned and walked away, leaving Miss Black staring at the darkening water. That evening Inspector Craddock telephoned from Much Benham. The telegram form was written on paper from the organist's music desk. Archer admits sending it. He says Miss Black paid him £20 to get Gladys out of the way for a day. Claims he thought it was just a harmless prank. He's terrified. Poor Mr. Archer, said Miss Marple. Greed makes cowards of us all. And the parcel in the pond contained the mate to the kid glove we found, I expect, and possibly something more interesting. You might ask young Leonard Spence to borrow a fishing rod. Craddock chuckled despite himself. You'll have the whole case solved before I've finished the paperwork. Oh, no, Inspector, said Miss Marple sweetly. I never interfere. I merely observe that when people throw things into duck ponds, they usually wish them to stay thrown. She rang off, drew her chair closer to the fire, and picked up her knitting. 4 balls of wool now lay in her basket. Dove gray, violet cream, and a deep, guilty brown. The pattern was almost complete. Chapter 6. The Parcel from the Duck Pond. Friday broke clear and cold, the first real bite of autumn in the air. By 9 o'clock half the village had found urgent reasons to loiter near the duck pond. Leonard Spence, the telegraph boy, had been pressed into service with a bamboo rod and a bent nail. Colonel Bantry stood by in +4s and field glasses, in case it should prove to be enemy action. Mrs. Dane Calthrop arrived with a thermos of Bovril and the calm of one who believes Providence will provide, and Miss Marple sat on the little green bench with her knitting. looking exactly like a harmless old lady enjoying the morning sun. The parcel came up at the third attempt. Sodden brown paper half dissolved, tied with the same hairy string Mrs. Swetnam used for her seed packets. Inside was the missing registered envelope addressed to Mrs. Lavinia Pinkerton, Lausanne postmark still legible, and wrapped around it for extra weight, one right-hand white kid glove, mate to the left-hand glove found behind the postal orders. The envelope was empty. Inspector Craddock, summoned from the police house where he had been interviewing a trembling Mr. Archer, took charge with quiet efficiency. "Seal broken and resealed with ordinary glue," he announced, holding it to the light. "Clever, but not clever enough." Mrs. Pinkerton, who had arrived in a state bordering on hysteria, gave a small wail. "My fortune, gone forever." Miss Marple laid down her needles. "Not gone, Lavinia, dear. Merely misplaced, like garden shears." She turned to Miss Black, who had appeared at the edge of the crowd wearing an expression of polite concern. "Such a pity about the glove," Miss Marple said gently. "Italian kid is so difficult to match. And now both are quite ruined." Miss Black met her gaze steadily. "I really cannot imagine why you address me, Miss Marple. I have no interest in Mrs. Pinkerton's affairs." "Except," said Miss Marple, "that the late Mrs. Hetherington's first will left you £20,000 and a life interest in the Swiss villa. The second will, destroyed according to Mrs. Pinkerton, left you nothing but a mourning brooch. And this third will, the one that traveled from Lausanne in a blue airmail cover, restored your legacy. Naturally, you were anxious it should arrive safely." Miss Black's smile was thin as a knife blade. "Conjecture is not evidence." "No," agreed Miss Marple, "but wet string is remarkably strong. Leonard, dear, would you be so kind as to untie that parcel again?" Slowly, Leonard, enjoying his moment of glory, peeled away the layers. A scrap of blue airmail paper clung to the inside of the wrapper. On it, in faded violet ink, were the words, "Revoke all previous testaments, my companion Letitia Blacklock." The crowd gave a collective intake of breath. Miss Black took one step backward. Inspector Craddock moved forward. "Letitia Blacklock, I must ask you—" She turned and ran. It was not a dignified departure. Miss Black was a tall woman, and the gravel path was slippery with duckweed. Colonel Bantry, who had played rugby for the army in his youth, stuck out a stout walking stick. Miss Black measured her length among the Michaelmas daisies. Handcuffs were not strictly necessary, but P.C. Polk applied them with a certain relish. In the hush that followed, Miss Marple resumed her knitting. "Dear me," she said mildly, "such a lot of trouble for £20,000, though I dare say the villa in Lausanne is pleasant in spring." That afternoon the church organ remained silent. Mr. Archer, released on police bail, was discovered by the vicar sitting in the darkened vestry, head in hands. "I never meant harm," he kept repeating. "She said it was only to delay the letter a day or two. She promised no one would be hurt. £20 for Jeremy's school fees. £20. The vicar, a gentle soul, patted his shoulder and spoke of forgiveness and the prodigal son. Miss Marple, calling later with a small plum cake, was less sentimental. "Mr. Archer," she said, "when a woman asks you to forge a telegram, impersonate a postmistress, burn a will, and perjure yourself for £20, it is wise to suspect that her friendship is not entirely disinterested." Archer looked up, eyes red. "She said we would be married once the money came, that I would never have to teach scales again." "Dear Mr. Archer," said Miss Marple, cutting him a generous slice of cake, "beautiful playing is no substitute for common sense, and scales are the foundation of everything, even morality." By tea-time, the village had settled into that comfortable state of shock which follows the unmasking of a villain who has, after all, turned out to be an outsider. Miss Blacklock, was not St. Mary Mead born and bred. She had only lived among them 2 weeks. That made everything much easier to bear. Only Miss Marple, pouring tea in her quiet drawing-room, was not entirely satisfied. "The real will has not yet appeared," she murmured to the robin on the windowsill. "And empty envelopes are all very well, but one does like to see justice properly tied with red tape." She reached for her writing paper and began a letter to an old friend at the Swiss probate registry. One never knew when a second copy might have been lodged. Outside, the leaves continued to fall, and the ducks on the pond resumed their quarrel over crumbs as though nothing of importance had occurred. But in the little white cottage the fire had gone out, the piano was closed, and the white kid gloves, both of them now, lay in an evidence bag at Much Benham police station, stained with pond water and the faint, indelible mark of guilt. Chapter 7. The Will in the Organ Pipes. Saturday brought a soft, reluctant drizzle that turned the high street into a watercolor of grays and muted greens. St. Mary Mead, having enjoyed its drama, now wished to put it tidily away, like a best tea service after a funeral. Miss Blacklock had been removed to Much Benham. Mr. Archer had taken to his bed with a nervous headache. Gladys Brent, restored to her counter, weighed stamps with the solemn air of one who has stared into the abyss and found it untidy. Only Miss Marple remained quietly busy. At 11 o'clock she presented herself at the church vestry, carrying a tin of shortbread and an expression of gentle determination. The vicar, Mr. Clement Dane Calthrop, greeted her with relief. "My dear Miss Marple, you are the very person. The organ has begun to cipher most alarmingly. Every time Mr. Archer's deputy plays the F-sharp on the great manual, it sounds like a goose with laryngitis. I fear something has lodged in the pipe." Miss Marple's eyes brightened. "How very unfortunate. Perhaps a mouse has built a nest. Mice do love organ pipes, they find the acoustics so flattering." She followed the vicar into the chilly nave. Young Mr. Harmon, the deputy organist, was coaxing a wheezing chord from the swell box. "Definitely something in the 8-foot principle," he said, wiping his forehead. "I've tried blowing down it, but whatever it is wedged tight." Miss Marple seated herself in the front pew, opened her tin, and offered shortbread all round. "Perhaps," she suggested, "one might remove the pipe and shake it gently, like a thermometer." Mr. Harmon, glad of any excuse to avoid climbing the organ loft ladder again, fetched a step-ladder and a torch. 10 minutes later, the offending pipe, labeled Great F-sharp, was laid reverently on the chancel steps. A rolled cylinder of stiff cream paper, sealed with purple wax and tied with pink tape, slid out and landed with a soft thud on the stone floor. The vicar picked it up gingerly. "Good heavens. It is addressed to Mrs. Lavinia Pinkerton, care of the post office, St. Mary Mead." Miss Marple allowed herself the smallest of smiles. How extraordinary. One quite sees why the note sounded distressed. The seal bore the imprint of a Swiss notary. Inside was the true last will of Mrs. Clara Hetherington, dated 3 days before her death, revoking all previous testaments and leaving her entire estate, some £65,000 in the villa at Caux, to her faithful companion Miss Letitia Blacklock, in gratitude for years of devoted service. A codicil added in a trembling hand left Mrs. Lavinia Pinkerton the sum of £500 for mourning clothes and keepsakes. The vicar sat down rather suddenly on a hassock. "Well," he said faintly, "this does rather alter things." "Indeed," said Miss Marple. "Poor Miss Blacklock went to a great deal of trouble for something that was already hers by right. One might almost feel sorry for her if one were not so very fond of justice." By luncheon, the document was in Inspector Craddock's hands, and Mrs. Pinkerton had taken to her bed with an attack of the vapors. Colonel Bantry was heard to remark that the whole affair served her right for having two wills in the first place. That afternoon, Miss Marple paid a final call on Gladys Brent. The postmistress was weighing parcels with renewed vigor as though to make up for lost time. "I shall never forgive myself," she said, eyes filling again. "To think I left my post because of a wicked telegram." Miss Marple patted her hand. "My dear Gladys, you were deceived by someone far cleverer than you, though not perhaps quite clever enough. Tell me, when Miss Blacklock asked to borrow your brown suitcase last week, did she return it promptly?" Gladys blinked. "Why, yes, on Monday morning. Said she needed it for an overnight journey and would bring it back before closing. Only she never did. And then the telegram came and I packed it again in such a hurry." "Exactly," said Miss Marple. "A borrowed suitcase, like borrowed shears, is easily forgotten when one has weightier matters on one's mind." She left Gladys weighing a parcel to Australia and walked home through the drizzle. At Danemead the fire was lit and the kettle singing. Miss Marple hung her mackintosh behind the door, warmed her hands, and considered the completed pattern in her mind. Letitia Blacklock had received the blue airmail envelope in her own post, opened it, discovered the will was entirely in her favor, and then, terrified that Mrs. Pinkerton would contest it on grounds of undue influence, had panicked. She had burnt the outer cover, forged blank pages into the registered packet, paid Archer to remove Gladys for a day, impersonated the postmistress to board the train, thus providing a false trail, and hidden the real will in the one place no one would think to look until winter cleaning: the organ pipe. A complicated plot, born of fear rather than greed. Miss Marple shook her head. "People do make things so much more difficult than they need be," she said to the robin who had flown in through the scullery window. A simple letter to a solicitor would have sufficed. The robin pecked a crumb from the hearthrug and looked unimpressed. Outside, the rain softened to a mist, and the church clock struck 4. Tomorrow would be Sunday. The organ would play again, properly this time, and the village would sing its familiar hymns, secure in the knowledge that wickedness had been uncovered and put decently away. Miss Marple poured herself a cup of tea, added exactly 1 lump, and allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction. Chapter 8. Miss Marple requests an experiment. Sunday was bright and blustery, the kind of October day that sends clouds racing across a washed blue sky and makes the vicar's sermon on gratitude feel almost unnecessary. St. Mary Mead turned out in its Sunday best. Hats renovated with new Petersham ribbon, gloves brushed, shoes polished to a mirror. Even the ducks on the pond wore an air of having been freshly laundered. After matins, Miss Marple invited a select company to tea at Danemead. The invitation, written in her neat, old-fashioned hand, had been delivered by Leonard Spence with all the gravity of a royal summons. Present were Inspector Craddock, who had postponed his return to headquarters; Mrs. Lavinia Pinkerton, swathed in black lace and indignation; Colonel and Mrs. Bantry, Nurse Tarrant, still faintly annoyed that her medical certificates had been part of the deception; Mr. Reginald Archer, pale, chastened, and wearing a new dark suit that made him look like an undertaker's clerk; and Miss Gladys Brent, who had been persuaded to close the post office for 1 hour on the Lord's Day in the interests of justice. The drawing-room fire crackled cheerfully. Seed cake, anchovy toast, and 2 kinds of sandwich stood ready on the gate-legged table. Miss Marple, in dove-gray wool and her mother's amethyst brooch, presided with gentle authority. "Thank you all for coming," she began, pouring tea as precisely as if she were measuring medicine. "Before Inspector Craddock takes any final steps, I thought it might be instructive to repeat Monday afternoon's little scene. A harmless experiment, nothing more." Mr. Archer flinched as though the teapot itself were evidence. Miss Marple smiled kindly. Gladys, dear, would you be so good as to sit at the small table by the window and pretend it is your counter? And each of you, if you please, will hand Gladys a fresh envelope exactly as you did on Monday last." She produced 5 new envelopes, identical in size and weight to the originals, each sealed with plain red wax. One by one they obeyed. Colonel Bantry marched up grumbling about unnecessary nonsense and placed his envelope with military precision. Mrs. Pinkerton fluttered forward, dabbing at her eyes, and laid hers down with a sigh that could have powered a small organ. Nurse Tarrant handed hers over briskly as though posting a prescription. Mr. Archer approached last. His hand, Miss Marple noted with quiet satisfaction, still bore the ghost of a violet stain beneath the cuff. He hesitated for the smallest fraction of a second, then placed his envelope on the pile. "Thank you," said Miss Marple sweetly. "That will be quite sufficient." She turned to the company. "You will notice that every envelope was handed openly in full view of Gladys. Yet on Monday, 5 envelopes were accepted and none dispatched. One was later found to contain blank paper, another to have been opened and resealed. How was this accomplished?" She paused, letting the silence grow comfortable, the way a good hostess allows the fire to settle. "Someone," she continued, "took advantage of a very simple fact. Gladys always turned away to fetch the registered book from the shelf behind her when a packet was presented. In that brief moment, 3 seconds at most, a second person wearing white kid gloves to avoid fingerprints substituted a prepared dummy envelope for the real one, slipping the genuine article into a large handbag or music case. All eyes turned to Mr. Archer. He had gone the color of cold porridge. Miss Marple's voice remained gentle. "You see, Mr. Archer, the left-hand glove we found had a tiny tear at the tip of the second finger mended with lighter thread. The right-hand glove from the pond had an identical mend, a pair in every sense, and only a pianist accustomed to rapid movement of the left hand could have performed the substitution so deftly." Archer made a small, strangled sound. Inspector Craddock leaned forward. "We also found traces of the same violet copying ink on the dummy envelope you prepared, Mr. Archer. And your pupil Jeremy has admitted that you paid him to forge an alibi." Archer rose unsteadily. She said it was only a postponement, that the will was rightfully hers and Mrs. Pinkerton would contest it out of spite. All I had to do was change one envelope and send a telegram to get Miss Brent away for a day. £20, Miss Marple, £20 and a promise of marriage when the money came. Mrs. Pinkerton gave a shriek that rattled the teacups. "Marriage? To that woman? Over my dead body?" "Quite possibly the original plan," murmured Colonel Bantry. Miss Marple raised a hand for silence. Miss Blacklock believed the will disinherited her. When it arrived in her own post, she panicked. She burnt the blue cover, forged blanks into the registered packet, and hid the real will in the organ pipe, intending to discover it later when suspicion had died down. A complicated scheme born of fear rather than wickedness. You, Mr. Archer, were merely the pair of hands she hired. She turned to Inspector Craddock. "The charge, I think, will be conspiracy to defeat the ends of justice rather than theft. Though I dare say the Swiss authorities will be interested in the attempted suppression of a legal document." Archer sank back into his chair, defeated. Miss Marple offered him the plate of anchovy toast. "Do have something, Mr. Archer. You look quite peaked." Gladys Brent began to cry quietly into her handkerchief. Miss Marple patted her shoulder. There, Gladys, you have been deceived, not dishonest, and the post office has its reputation restored." She lifted her cup in a small, gracious toast. "To clarity," she said, "and to the comforting knowledge that in the end, truth will always come out, rather like a document from an organ pipe when the F sharp is played." Outside, the sun broke through the clouds and laid a benevolent light across the village. The church bell began to ring for evensong, clear and true. Inside Danemead, the fire settled into comfortable embers, and Miss Marple's knitting needles resumed their soft, satisfied click. Another pattern completed, another piece of village life set gently to rights. Chapter 9. The Drawing Room Denouement. The following Tuesday at 4:30 precisely, the same company assembled once more in Miss Marple's drawing room. Rain pattered against the windows like impatient fingers. The fire glowed ruby red. The tea table was laid with the best Royal Albert and a Victoria sponge so light it threatened to float. This time Miss Letitia Blacklock was present, brought from Much Benham under escort but not yet charged. She sat very straight in the chintz armchair, hands folded, the cairngorm brooch rising and falling with her measured breathing. Mr. Archer stood by the mantelpiece as though hoping the overmantel might swallow him whole. Inspector Craddock closed the door and took up his position beside it. The room settled into that particular hush that falls when everyone knows the last act is about to begin. Miss Marple laid aside her knitting and regarded the assembly with the gentle benevolence of a headmistress on prize day. "Thank you all for coming on such a damp afternoon. Inspector Craddock has kindly allowed me a few moments to set the picture straight, so that no lingering misunderstandings remain." She lifted a small pile of documents tied with pink tape, the real will, the forged blanks, the scorched fragments, the two white kid gloves now reunited and looking faintly ashamed of themselves. "Let us begin at the beginning," she said pleasantly. Mrs. Clara Hetherington died in Lausanne, believing she had restored her fortune to her companion, Miss Blacklock. She posted the new will to Mrs. Pinkerton with instructions that it be forwarded to the solicitors. A covering letter in a blue airmail envelope explained everything. That blue envelope arrived at the White Cottage by the duck pond on Monday morning, addressed to Miss Blacklock herself. Because Mrs. Hetherington had grown confused in her last illness and forgotten the forwarding arrangement. Miss Blacklock opened it, read the will, and discovered to her astonishment and relief that she was the principal beneficiary. Most people would have telephoned the solicitor at once, but Miss Blacklock feared that Mrs. Pinkerton would contest the will on grounds of undue influence. Panic overtook her. Instead of rejoicing, she decided the will must seem never to have arrived at all. She burnt the blue cover in her own grate, forged blank pages into the registered packet Mrs. Pinkerton had handed to Gladys, and paid Mr. Archer £20 to perform the sleight of hand substitution while Gladys turned for the registered book. She then forged the telegram that lured poor Gladys to Much Benham, borrowed the brown suitcase, donned veil and gloves, and boarded the 8:27 in Gladys's place, so that the village would believe the postmistress had absconded with the letters. Finally, she hid the real will inside the organ pipe where it would not be found until the spring cleaning, by which time she hoped the fuss would have died down and she could discover it herself. Miss Blacklock's lips were a thin line, but she did not speak. Miss Marple turned to Archer. "You, Mr. Archer, believed you were merely delaying an inconvenient document. You little thought your £20 would buy you a part in attempted fraud." Archer made a broken gesture. "She said we would marry, that I should never have to teach scales again." Mrs. Pinkerton gave an audible sniff of outrage. Miss Marple continued serenely. "Everything went according to plan until the organ developed a cipher. Young Mr. Harmon played F-sharp rather too enthusiastically on Sunday, and the will slid out like a rabbit from a hat." She smiled at Inspector Craddock. "The rest you know. The gloves, the ink, the borrowed suitcase, the parcel in the pond, all unnecessary flourishes. Fear makes people elaborate, Inspector. Simplicity is the mark of innocence." Miss Blacklock rose suddenly, tall and commanding even in defeat. "Very well, Miss Marple. You have been excessively clever. But Clara Hetherington was in her right mind when she made that will, and Lavinia would have fought it tooth and nail. I merely protected what was mine. Mrs. Pinkerton bristled like an angry sparrow. Protected? You tried to rob me of my rights. No, said Miss Blacklock quietly. I tried to keep what Clara wished me to have. There is a difference. Miss Marple looked from one woman to the other with compassionate detachment. In law, she said, there may be a difference. In human hearts, very little. Both of you loved the same difficult woman in your different ways. Both of you feared losing her a second time. She turned to Craddock. I believe, Inspector, the charge will be attempting to pervert the course of justice rather than theft. And since the true will has now been proved, no financial harm was done, only a great deal of unnecessary alarm. Craddock inclined his head. That will be for the Director of Public Prosecutions, but I think you are right, Miss Marple. Miss Blacklock gave a wintry smile. Then I may keep the villa at Caw? And the 65,000, Craddock confirmed. Mrs. Pinkerton opened her mouth to protest, took one look at Miss Marple's mild blue eyes, and closed it again. Miss Marple lifted the teapot. China or Indian, Miss Blacklock, and do try the Victoria sponge. My maid Cherry makes it with 7 eggs. One must keep one's strength up at a time like this. For a moment the room hovered on the edge of farce. Then Miss Blacklock laughed, a short, surprised sound, and accepted both tea and sponge. Outside, the rain eased to a gentle whisper against the panes. Inside, the fire settled, the clock ticked, and St. Mary Mead prepared to forgive, forget, and, above all, talk about it for the next 20 years. Chapter 10. Morning tea and quiet satisfaction. Word count 1,000 exactly. A week later, the rain had gone, the leaves had settled into damp carpets of gold and rust, and St. Mary Mead wore the peaceful, slightly smug expression of a village that has had its excitement and come out the better for it. Miss Jane Marple sat on the little sheltered porch of Danemead, shelling peas into a willow-patterned bowl. The sun struck warm through the glass, the robin hopped along the path expecting crumbs, and the church clock struck 11 with leisurely precision. Inspector Craddock's Wolseley crunched up the gravel. He climbed out carrying a small official envelope and an expression of resigned admiration. I thought you would like to know the final chapter, Miss Marple. The director has decided on a caution for Miss Blacklock and a bound-over order for Archer. No prosecution. The will has been admitted to probate. Miss Blacklock leaves for Switzerland next month. Mrs. Pinkerton has received her £500 and a handsome set of fish knives from the legatee as a token of reconciliation. Miss Marple smiled. Very proper. Fish knives are always acceptable. Craddock accepted a cup of coffee. Cherry had taken to making it specially for him, and a slice of the previous day's seed cake. Archer has resigned the organist's post. Young Harmon is to take over, and Gladys Brent has been awarded a small gratuity by the Postmaster General for loyal service under trying circumstances. Gladys will buy her cottage in Budleigh Salterton after all, said Miss Marple with satisfaction. She showed me the brochure only yesterday. The inspector stirred his coffee. I still don't quite understand why Miss Blacklock went to such lengths when the money was already hers. Miss Marple dropped another handful of peas into the bowl. Fear, Inspector. Fear is a great disturber of common sense. She had spent years listening to Mrs. Pinkerton complain about those dreadful theosophists, and to Clara wavering between sister and companion. When the will arrived in her own letterbox, she panicked, imagining lawsuits, accusations of undue influence, perhaps even the loss of everything. So she tried to make the will disappear altogether, until she could produce it at a moment of her own choosing. A complicated solution to a simple problem. Craddock chuckled. And the organ pipe. A moment of inspiration born of desperation. Organ pipes are cleaned only once every 10 years. By the time the next cleaner arrived, she would have been safely established as the rightful heir. Mrs. Bantry arrived at that moment rosy from her walk, carrying a jar of her celebrated damson jelly. Well, Jane, another triumph. Though I must say I never suspected Miss Blacklock. I thought it was the nurse all along, those medical certificates, you know. Miss Marple poured her old friend a cup of tea. My dear Dolly, Nurse Tarrant is far too busy keeping the village alive to have time for forgery. No, it was always a crime of panic rather than greed. And panic invariably over-elaborates. Colonel Bantry's voice boomed from the gate. Hoy there! May an old soldier join the party? He strode up the path, mackintosh flapping, and accepted tea with the air of a man who has earned it. Heard the latest, he announced. Miss Blacklock has given the church a new set of hymn books in gratitude for the organ's timely cough, and young Archer is going to Canada. Says he can't bear to hear another scale as long as he lives. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. Canada is very large. He will have plenty of room to forget. The little group sat in companionable silence for a moment, watching the sunlight move across the flower beds. A blackbird sang from the apple tree. Somewhere a child called to another across the quiet lane. Mrs. Bantry sighed contentedly. It's extraordinary, Jane, how you see through people. All those clues, gloves, ink, organ pipes, like a jigsaw. Miss Marple dropped the last pea into the bowl and brushed a strand of gray hair from her forehead. Not extraordinary at all, Dolly. Merely the accumulation of a lifetime spent observing that human nature is much the same wherever one goes. Greed, fear, love, vanity. They wear different dresses in different villages, but the figures underneath are always recognizable. Add a pair of white kid gloves too fine for everyday wear, a borrowed suitcase, and a gentleman who stains his left hand with copying ink. And the picture becomes quite clear. Inspector Craddock set down his cup. You make it sound so simple. It is simple, said Miss Marple. Once one discards the red herrings and remembers that people are rarely wicked, only frightened or foolish or both. She rose and gathered the empty cups. And now, if you will forgive me, I have a scarf to finish for my great niece, and Cherry will be wanting the peas for luncheon. The visitors took their leave, Craddock to his paperwork, the Bantrys to gossip gently over the gate with old Miss Hartnell, who had just emerged with her shopping basket. Miss Marple stood at the door a moment longer, watching them go. The robin landed on the path and cocked its head expectantly. She scattered a few crumbs from her pocket. There, my dear. Life returns to normal. The post office opens at the proper time. The organ plays in tune, and even the ducks have stopped quarreling. The robin pecked, satisfied. Miss Marple closed the door, picked up her knitting, and settled by the fire. The needles began their soft, familiar click. Outside, St. Mary Mead basked in the pale November sun, secure in the knowledge that whatever small storms might blow up from time to time, there would always be a quiet house at the end of the lane where an elderly lady with bright blue eyes and an innocent smile would set the world gently to rights over a cup of tea. And that, after all, was more than enough.